It all began when Jasmine Crockett took the floor during what was expected to be a routine congressional oversight session. The discussion had largely focused on ethics in government, with familiar arguments echoing across the chamber, and, without raising her voice or signaling anything out of the ordinary, Crockett quietly reached for a slim manila folder that had been sitting untouched in front of her for most of the hearing. The air changed almost instantly. She calmly began to speak, her tone measured and even, her words landing like quiet thuds in the still room. I'd like to bring attention to a financial transaction from 2016 that has not been thoroughly reviewed by this committee, she said, flipping through the first few pages. Her colleagues leaned in, some out of curiosity, others with skepticism. She held up a document and read from it. It's a transfer of $2.4 million made in September of that year, she continued, from an account registered in Cyprus to a real estate holding company based in Ljubljana, Slovenia. That might have seemed unremarkable at first glance, but then came the detail that shifted everything. This holding company, at the time, was controlled by Viktor Neves, the father of Melania and Trump. The chamber froze. She clarified that the transfer had been flagged not by a political agency, but through an automated system used by European banks to detect irregular movement of money that could be tied to tax evasion or money laundering. The flagged report had been quietly passed along through international channels and eventually logged into the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network database, an obscure part of the U.S. Treasury not often discussed in public hearings. Crockett did not accuse anyone of a crime. She didn't even imply wrongdoing directly. What she did instead was walk through a paper, trail dates, amounts, entities, and regulations all tied together with an attorney's precision. It was clear she had done her homework. She pointed out that the company receiving the funds was dissolved less than a year later, and that none of its assets ever showed up in any disclosed filings. She added, "We're not talking about an obscure cousin or distant relative. We are talking about immediate family, individuals with regular access to the White House and proximity to the highest level of national influence." Still, she kept her delivery composed. She didn't lean into the drama of the moment. She didn't gloat or inject theatrical flair. That calmness only amplified the effect. Her presentation included a series of SWIFT codes from international banks, showing how the money moved through intermediaries. These weren't political talking points, they were financial facts. She submitted copies of the flagged wire notice, statements from a compliance officer at a European bank, and records showing how the company involved had no business activity. In the months following the transaction, all of it was methodical and data-driven. At no point did she veer into speculation. She kept returning to a central point. Why was this family member receiving a large international wire transfer from a flagged account at a politically sensitive time, and why had no one asked about it before? Some members of the committee shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others scribbled notes furiously. There were even a few audible scoffs from the opposite side of the aisle, but Crockett held the room in her grip. She ended her remarks with a question, not an accusation. Given the volume of scrutiny placed on public servants and their families, shouldn't we apply the same standard of transparency across the board, especially when foreign financial activity is involved? The power of her words lay in their restraint. She never had to raise her voice, never needed to declare a smoking gun. She simply exposed a paper trail that had, until that moment, been lost in the background noise of a chaotic political era. And by placing that paper trail in plain view, she ignited a conversation that no one in the room had anticipated. The moment the document was read aloud and the transaction involving Melania, Trump's father, was made public, there was an undeniable tension in the room. The committee chamber, normally filled with procedural back and forth and political posturing, suddenly felt electric. But it wasn't just the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's delivery. It was the unmistakable sound of someone unmuting their mic on the live feed that followed. Donald Trump, appearing via live video testimony from his estate, had been relatively quiet up until that point, watching the proceedings with a mixture of boredom and disdain. That changed the second his wife's name entered the conversation. His face, previously impassive, tightened. The expression was immediate: furrowed brows, narrowed eyes, jaw clenched. Then came the outburst. What the hell are you even talking about? He snapped, the sound of his voice ricocheting through the chamber's speakers. The committee chair attempted to restore order, politely asking that all participants wait their turn to speak. But Trump wasn't interested in protocol. He leaned forward, his face inches from the camera, voice raised. You're dragging my wife into this nonsense now, he demanded, visibly agitated. This is disgusting, shameful. You people have no limits. Jasmine Crockett, still seated, didn't flinch. She looked down at her folder and then calmly met the camera's gaze. Sir, with all due respect, these documents come directly from international compliance alerts and public financial databases. They are not fabrications, and they speak for themselves. Trump's voice cut back in almost immediately. I don't care where they came from, this is a hoax. a total 100% fabricated, disgraceful hoax. His voice rose with every sentence. You're making up stories about my family, about my wife, how dare you? Asterisk. The committee chair again stepped in, this time more forcefully, warning Trump that, if he continued to interrupt, he would be muted. But Trump's response was another verbal barrage. Asterisk. This is what the radical left does. They dig up garbage, they twist it, and they throw it on national TV just to get clicks and headlines. I've seen this game before. You're not fooling anyone. Asterisk. Despite the threats and accusations, Crockett remained composed. Sir, she said again, no one has accused your wife of a crime. This committee is examining potential foreign financial influence. That's our responsibility. If the transaction is innocent, it should be clarified through proper channels. But that only seemed to enrage him further. There's nothing to clarify, Trump barked. You're trying to smear her because you can't touch me. You people are obsessed. Asterisk. At this point, murmurs spread across the room. Some committee members were visibly uncomfortable, others simply stunned by the spectacle. Even members who were typically aligned with Trump seemed hesitant to speak. This wasn't political theater, it was raw, emotional, and increasingly chaotic. Asterisk. Trump began to gesture wildly at the camera, repeating his claims that it was a witch hunt, that his wife was being targeted unfairly, that the committee was corrupt and dishonest. Every few seconds, he raised his voice another notch. Asterisk. Then, abruptly, the feed cut out. The committee chair had ordered Trump's mic muted. Asterisk. There was a pause, followed by a stunned silence in the room. Some stared at the screen, now showing only Trump's image in silence, his mouth moving angrily without sound. Others turned to Crockett, who remained seated, her folder now closed, her posture unchanged. Asterisk. She hadn't said much after Trump's outburst, and she didn't need to. The contrast between her calm, methodical delivery and his emotional eruption had already shaped the narrative. Where she had presented facts, he had offered fury. Where she had asked questions, he had hurled accusations. Asterisk. And even though Trump couldn't be heard anymore, the damage was already done. The image of him shouting, red-faced, while Crockett sat calmly, holding official documents, was beamed across every news channel and splashed across social media platforms within minutes. The story wasn't just about a financial transaction. Anymore, it was about a former president losing control on live TV in front of millions. Asterisk. As the dust settled from the explosive exchange, something unexpected began to unfold. The moment that had started with a financial document and escalated into a furious tirade from Donald Trump now began shifting into something far more about paperwork or scandal, but about character. Asterisk. While Trump's voice had dominated the audio, his demeanor had defined the visual. The former president's angry gestures, flushed face, and repeated interruptions had been captured in real time and broadcast across multiple news outlets. For many viewers, it wasn't the content of his words that stood out. It was the tone, the volatility, the complete lack of composure from a man who once held the highest office in the country. Asterisk. And then, there was Jasmine Crockett. Asterisk. Throughout Trump's outburst, she had not once raised her voice. She didn't roll her eyes, she didn't talk over him, and she didn't respond with emotion. Her restraint, measured and controlled, became its statement. She had read a document, asked a pointed question, and let the evidence speak. His response, loud and deeply personal, seemed only to affirm the weight of the inquiry. Asterisk. Even those who didn't fully agree with Crockett's politics found themselves nodding in reluctant respect. Her professionalism amid chaos had caught people off guard. She had not come to provoke, she had come prepared, and in doing so, she had drawn an unmistakable contrast. Asterisk. Inside the chamber, that contrast became the silent conversation. Some Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware of how the exchange would be perceived. One congressman leaned over to whisper to a colleague, his glance sliding toward the muted screen where Trump still visibly ranted. Their discomfort was clear, not necessarily with the documents themselves, but with the optics of the moment. A former president losing his temper in real time, while a freshman representative maintained the demeanor of a federal judge. Asterisk. Outside the room, the response was swift. On cable news panels that night, conservative analysts who typically echoed Trump's defenses hesitated. One host on a right-leaning network admitted, whether you agree with her or not, Crockett showed a level of discipline we don't often see in these hearings. Asterisk. Social media picked it up quickly. Clips circulated not of the documents or even the hearing in full, but of the visual split screen. Crockett seated quietly, flipping pages, and Trump on the other side, shouting into his webcam, visibly agitated, and pointing into the lens. Asterisk. The irony was not lost on many. Donald Trump, a man who had spent years branding himself as the strong, composed leader, had unraveled on camera in response to a calm line of inquiry. Jasmine Crockett, relatively new to the national stage, had not shouted a single word and yet had managed to command the entire room. Asterisk. That moment became symbolic. Asterisk. The hearing had been scheduled as just another oversight sessions, something to satisfy procedural obligations. But because of how Trump reacted, it took on a new meaning. It wasn't just about whether a transaction had been inappropriate or legal. It became a study in temperament, in leadership, and in how those under pressure reveal their truest selves. Asterisk journalists began pointing out that Crockett had offered no accusations, just a document, a pattern, and a question. Trump's eruption in response wasn't a rebuttal, it was an emotional reaction to the discomfort of scrutiny. And rather than diffusing the situation, his behavior had amplified the seriousness of what had been revealed. Asterisk that contrast began to resonate even among voters who had grown weary of partisan theater. People weren't praising Crockett for owning Trump or delivering a takedown. They were praising her for acting like an adult in a room where so many others had not. Asterisk the moment served as a political mirror, and in that mirror, one figure was shouting red-faced, demanding respect while offering none. The other was seated, composed, and letting the facts, however uncomfortable, speak for themselves. Asterisk. In the days that followed, the fallout from Jasmine Crockett's .com handling of the situation continued to reverberate across political discourse, becoming a pivotal moment in the ongoing national conversation about transparency and accountability. For public figures, what had initially seemed like another routine hearing had morphed into a scandal that involved much more than a single financial transaction. It became a moment of reckoning for Donald Trump and his family's dealings, one that reignited debates about the role of money, influence, and foreign entanglements in American politics. Asterisk. The controversy surrounding the documents presented by Crockett soon took on a life of its own. Headlines shifted away from the specific details of the wire transfer and instead focused on the broader implications of the hearing. Journalists, both liberal and conservative, began framing it as a question of whether any public official, or their family, should be able to operate with such little oversight when foreign financial dealings were involved. Asterisk. Trump's response only intensified this debate. His emotional outburst, the way he had lost control in front of the camera, became a symbol of his unwillingness to engage with hard questions. Despite his attempts to discredit the documents and Crockett's line of inquiry, the more he protested, the more people began to ask, what was he hiding? Why had his reaction been so visceral? Asterisk. The narrative surrounding the incident quickly evolved from what did the documents show, to what is Trump so afraid of. The facts presented by Crockett were solid and verifiable, and yet, rather than confronting them head-on, Trump had dismissed the inquiry with anger and accusations. His refusal to calmly address the concerns of the committee only served to fuel speculation about what might be lurking beneath the surface. As the story spread, the public's perception of the exchange began to shift. No longer was it just about the content of the documents. It was about the larger issue of foreign influence and the financial dealings of public figures. The questions raised by Crockett's inquiry didn't simply disappear after the committee session ended, lingered, gnawing at the public conscience. Asterisk. On news networks, the story began to gain traction in a way that few expected. Conservative commentators who had previously defended Trump were now forced to grapple with the fallout. There was a growing discomfort within some of his staunchest allies. Trump had always presented himself as a fighter unafraid to confront his adversaries and deflect attacks. But now, it seemed as if he couldn't face the simple, straightforward challenge of responding to the kind of questions that any public official would typically be expected to answer. Asterisk. For many, the shift in narrative was stark. Crockett's composed fact-based presentation had left Trump flailing. In the weeks that followed, some commentators on the right, while still loyal to the former president, began to wonder whether this was the type of leadership the country needed. Trump's refusal to engage thoughtfully with an issue that was squarely in his family's domain gave rise to more serious concerns about the broader implications of his presidency. What had seemed like an isolated moment in a committee hearing quickly spiraled into a debate about the transparency and ethics of not only the Trump family, but the broader question of how foreign money influences American politics. Asterisk. The questions that Crockett had raised questions about financial transparency, about foreign involvement in domestic politics, and about the integrity of public figures were not going away. In fact, the more Trump's team attempted to shut down the narrative, the more determined some members of the public became to get answers. The committee's questioning of him had opened a floodgate, and the media attention surrounding the incident only made the questions more persistent. Asterisk. Among those who had once been part of Trump's core base of support, the growing scrutiny was beginning to resonate. The question was no longer just about what Trump knew or didn't know about a specific transaction. It was about whether a public figure who had claimed to drain the swamp was, in fact, operating in a world of unchecked financial dealings. With little to no accountability, for some, this incident brought all the questions of Trump's business dealings into sharper focus, forcing them to reconsider whether the man who had promised transparency and accountability was, in fact, the very thing he had railed against. Asterisk. And as the hearings continued, this story became a central point of focus. The idea of foreign financial influence on American politics had never seemed more urgent, and with Trump's loud refusal to directly engage with it, the pressure only grew. Crockett's questions had begun a much larger conversation, one that could not be ignored. Asterisk. In the aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's quiet but seismic presentation, the political landscape found itself grappling with more than just another headline. What had begun as a seemingly small inquiry into a foreign financial transaction evolved into a moment that tested the character and temperament of one of the most influential figures in modern American politics. It wasn't just about the $2.4 million transfer or the Slovenian holding company. It was about what that moment revealed when the spotlight intensified. Donald Trump's explosive reaction broadcast live for the nation to see ended up telling a story far more compelling than the documents themselves. His anger, his refusal to let others speak, and his desperate attempts to reframe the issue as a personal attack only reinforced the public's sense that there was something more beneath the surface. While Trump had built his political persona around being a fighter, this particular outburst didn't feel strong, it felt defensive. For many Americans watching, it wasn't a show of dominance, but a revealing lapse in composure. Meanwhile, Crockett's.com, evidence-based demeanor didn't just win her praise, it gave weight to her words. She didn't sensationalize the information. She didn't accuse or grandstand. She simply laid out a paper trail and asked a question. And in doing so, she struck at the core of what congressional oversight is meant to do. Not to score political points, but to bring the truth, however uncomfortable, into the public sphere. The legacy of this moment may not lie in any single document or headline. Instead, it lies in how it reframed the debate about accountability. It forced Americans to once again consider who gets to be questioned, who is held to account, and how leadership is revealed under pressure. In the contrast between a former president's rage and a freshman congresswoman's restraint, many found a new way to measure credibility, not by how loudly someone defends themselves, but by how well they face scrutiny. In a political era defined by spectacle, Crockett's quiet approach cut through the noise. And ironically, it was Trump's loudest response that made the quietest point feel undeniable. That contrast, the steady voice versus the shouting, has now become etched into the national conversation. Whether or not further investigations reveal anything more substantial, the moment already left a mark. It showed the American people what it looks like when emotion overwhelms facts, and what it looks like when facts stand firm, regardless of who tries to shout them down. And for millions watching, that moment told them everything they needed to know.